Hello everybody. I thought I would do a video about the finances of the Mormon Church. There was an article that came out on December 17th, 2019 called Mormon Church Has Misled Members on $100 billion Tax-Exempt Investment Fund, Whistleblower Alleges. That's not 100 million with an M, it's 100 billion with a B. And then, so that article talks about that the IRS on November 21st, 2019 received a 73-page whistleblower report. There was a investment manager of this Mormon church fund and his brother, if I understand it correctly, he gave all this information to his brother. And his brother took a sabbatical from his job and spent several months compiling all this data together and sent it to the IRS. And he figured since that IRS report would never see the light of day, that he made it available to the public. And so I am, in this description of this video, I'm going to put a link to the article that I first read, and then also to the where you can read the entire 73-page whistleblower report, which I did. And I thought I would just talk about the highlights of it so that you are aware of what the Mormons are doing. And this is especially to people who are part of the Mormon Church, so you know what's going on. They mention in here a little bit about what the Mormon Church teaches, and one of the things they mention in the whistleblower report is that a good Mormon is considered to be church broke. Sort of like you break a horse. You know, a horse has his own will. He wants to do whatever he wants to do. You break the horse, meaning you get the horse to conform to what you want the horse to do. Well, that's what Mormonism means when they talk about church broke. Someone is broken into the church. Someone who is church broke tends to accept direction without question and dismiss any red flags prematurely because of a reverence and deference to authority. So in other words, a good Mormon looks at the Mormon leadership and just believes whatever they say without question. And I hope that going through this video, if you are a Mormon, that you will decide not to be a good Mormon, not to be church broke, but to just look at the facts the way they are. Personally, I grew up in a church that, and I believed whatever the church taught me. But then when I became older, then I realized that some of the things they taught were against what the Bible taught, and so then I did not believe those church teachings anymore. And so I would encourage all those Mormons out there to do the same. Just because the Mormon church tells you something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's best to look at the facts of the situation and believe the truth. As Jesus said in the book of John, the truth shall make you free. And so that's the goal, is for you to know this. And what I learned from the whistleblower report, basically, just give you summaries, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in a legal term, is actually referred to as COP, which is short for Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You may not have known, if you're a Mormon, that you're actually going to a church that's considered to be a corporation. They call themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but in legal terms, in the United States anyway, they are COP. They are the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And what they did was, back in 1987, I believe it was, they created a separate fund where they would keep all their assets, and it was kept separate from the COP, the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that fund is EPA, which stands for Ensign Peak Advisors, which is basically, you could consider it sort of like an investment group. And they get the money that comes from the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church brings in around $7 billion per year in tithing donations. and it spends about 5, maybe 6 billion of that each year. And so then there is at least $1 to $2 billion each year just from tithing donations that is in excess of all their operations. You know, the expenses they have for all their buildings, the light, utilities, the salaries of people, just worldwide. The Mormon Church has about $5 to $6 billion per year in expenses, but they get $7 billion per year in tithing. And so then they take the excess of $1 billion to $2 billion per year, and they put it into this Ensign Peak Advisors, or EPA, which was created around 1987. I'm sorry, my math is wrong. 1997. 1997 is what I meant to say. It's created around 1997, and it was created basically as a way to hide money. Because then when the COP, the Mormon Church, tells their members what they have, they can say that they don't have, much money, because what they're basically, the EPA is a slush fund where they can hide the money for the Mormon members. So they can tell the Mormon members how much money they get in tithing, how much money they expend, how much money goes to missions and all this stuff. And then they're not reporting at all on their investment fund, because that's a completely separate, it's a 501c3 corporation, meaning that it is a nonprofit. And under nonprofit rules, you're supposed to give money out for the general use of the public. In other words, whenever a 501c3 is created, it has to have a general public use, is the idea. And then you have to use that money to help out the public. And if you don't, technically the IRS could say that it's not a nonprofit and it's really a for-profit, and so then they have to pay taxes. The way they avoid taxes is a religious organization is supposedly providing spiritual services to the people, and so they use the money for that, and so they're not really in the process, they're not trying to make money is the idea, but they're just trying to help the spiritual well-being of their parishioners. And so then they can use the money and not have to pay taxes to the government. That's the idea of a 501c3. But the problem is with what the Mormon Church has done is they've gotten a profit of $1 billion to $2 billion every single year for the last 22 years, from 1997 to 2019, and then they've socked that away into an investment fund where they're earning interest on it. And if you know anything about investments, the longer you have money that just sits there and you get interest, it compounds. Because if you get, let's say you have $100, let's say, and you get 1% interest in a year, well, now you have $101. Well, then the next year you get 1% on that. Well, now you get $101.01, and then $101, and now you got $102.01. You got a 10% interest on the interest that was the year before. And as you keep going up in assets, as years go on, you keep compounding this interest, and it just keeps growing like crazy, especially after, say, 15, 20 years. Then the interest compounding really kicks in big time. Well, EPA started by the Mormon Church after they had amassed about $10 billion. And they started it in 1997 with $10 billion. And now, 22 years later, in 2019, when the Whistleblower report was given, it had grown to $101 billion. And the reason is because, now remember, the EPA is its own 501c3, which means by law, all private foundations must distribute a minimum of 5% of investments each year or face a severe tax penalty. But in the whole 22 years, EPA has only made 2 distributions in 22 years, and the 2 distributions were not for the use of public, but they were for the use of for-profit businesses that the Mormons owned. One was a $600 million bailout for a for-profit life insurance company that the Mormons owned in 2009. And then there was a second distribution of $1.4 billion because the Mormons own their own mall, a City Creek Mall. I think it's in Salt Lake City, Utah. And they had some cost overruns. So then they used $1.4 billion. So EPA has $101 billion of Mormon money. And in 22 years, they've only made 2 distributions. And those 2 distributions did not help out the nonprofit COP Mormon organization at all. All it did was help out their own for-profit businesses that weren't doing good. And so by IRS laws, and that's why this Mormon whistleblower report was given to the IRS, because by IRS laws, they should be having to pay taxes, severe tax penalties on this, because they're not distributing any money for good causes. So, to let you know about how the Mormon structure is, the COP, or the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a sole proprietorship. Meaning, like for example, if I wanted to start my own business as a sole proprietor, that means I own the whole thing. I don't have a partner. I don't have a corporation with shareholders. It is a sole proprietorship that is owned by the president of the COP, which is basically the head guy in the Mormonism, which right now is Russell M. Nelson, who is the Mormon president. He is a 95-year-old guy. So he owns COP. Well, then you've got this separate corporation, the Ensign Peak Advisors, which is the nonprofit that has the $101 billion secretly stashed away in it, that most Mormons don't even know that EPA exists, Ensign Peak Advisors, which is why I'm doing this video, so that hopefully some Mormons will wake up and learn that they're stashing your money that you're putting away in your tithing, they're stashing it away into this secret fund that has grown to over $100 billion. Well, the COP is owned by the Mormon president, Mr. Russell M. Nelson. The EPA, or Ensign Peak Advisors, has 3 trustees. And the 3 trustees currently, let's see if I can find it in my notes here, the 3 trustees currently are, of course, Mr. Russell M. Nelson, the Mormon president. He is also a trustee. You talk about a conflict of interest there. He's over both organizations. The other trustees, there are 2 other trustees. The other one is Dallin H. Oaks. He is basically in the Mormon organization. He is the vice president. He is 87 years old. And then the other trustee is Henry B. Eyring, E-Y-R-I-N-G, who is the second counselor to the president, and he is 86 years old. So you got 3 old white guys who are the trustees for EPA, and they are the same guys who are the top guys from COP, or for the Mormon Church. So it's essentially the same thing. Mormonism and EPA is the same thing. But by having their own little organization of this EPA, they can sock away all this money that the tithing of the Mormon people comes from. And what are they going to do with it? The law says you must distribute a minimum of 5% each year or face a severe tax penalty. And because that's what a nonprofit is. They're not supposed to gather up a bunch of money. They're supposed to use it for public purposes, for the public good. And instead, they've grown from 10 billion to 101 billion because they don't make any distributions except 2 distributions, which is not for the public good, but is for for-profit businesses. So, according to the EPA, Ensign Peak Advisors, they have 4 initiatives Why do they exist? Well, they got to tell why they exist. They've got 4 reasons. One is to fund prophetic initiatives, which they've never done. 2 is to supplement the COP operating budget, which they've never done because they always have a surplus of tithing over the expenses, so they've never done that. 3rd is to backstop pension plan, which they've never done either. And then the 4th purpose is to post collateral for COP operations, which they've not needed to do anyway because COP is self-funding and that they get more tithes than expenses. So the 4 purposes of the EPA, they don't meet any of those things. But so in the past couple of years, EPA's managing director, Roger Clark, has said that the EPA will be used in the second coming. So the reason they're stockpiling all this money, according to the managing director, is so that Jesus can use it when he comes to the earth. Here's a quote from him. Most Mormons believe in a literal second coming of Christ when he would gather together his chosen people and preserve them from global burning on the condition that they had paid a full tithing to the Mormon church throughout their lives. By the way, full tithe is not on net income, it's on gross income before taxes are taken out. In Mormon culture, this is sometimes referred to as paying your fire insurance premium. Fire insurance premium. So your tithe is really to keep you from burning when Jesus Christ comes back. So you're paying your fire insurance premium. In the pulpit, tithing is taught as a temporal blessing, where the windows of heaven pour out tangible blessings to the faithful. It is therefore somewhat ironic, and that's the end of the quote, it is therefore somewhat ironic that church lawyers, Curtin and McConkie, caused the annual tithing settlement form in 2016 to start including the words, the church, quote, this is what the annual tithing statement in 2016 that was given to Mormon members by the Mormon Church. This is what it says, quote, the church provided no goods or services in consideration in whole or in part for the contributions detailed below, but only intangible religious benefits. But what's preached from the pulpit is you got to give your tithe so that you don't get burned by Jesus Christ at his second coming. So you're paying your fire insurance premium is what you're doing. But the lawyers say, oh, well, we don't provide you anything. We just provide intangible religious benefits. And the point in their whistleblower thing, quote from there is, one would think that Jesus in the sky wouldn't need to work very hard to convince investors of his credit worthiness should he return and need money. How much does Scientology's EPA get to stow away for when Xenu, dictator of the Galactic Confederacy, might return? That's a quote from the Mormon whistleblower thing. If you know anything, Scientology and Mormonism and Masonry seem to be all connected. And so they even put that in there. Scientology, why does EPA get to store over $100 billion for Jesus when he comes back at his second coming? When how much does Scientology get to store away for their savior, Xenu? That's pretty funny. And yeah, what about his credit worthiness? I mean, this is Jesus. If Jesus has the power, as they claim, to just burn up the entire world, which he's going to do, except for the good Mormon faithful who have paid their full tithing, then if Jesus has that power, why does he need his church to gather $100 billion for him? Wouldn't Jesus, with the power to annihilate the whole world, wouldn't he also have the power to do whatever he wants? Why would he need money? And what good would money do anyway? I mean, you think about it, if Jesus comes and he just burns up the whole world except for the Mormon faithful, I would assume the Mormon faithful are not head guys in the governments. So if you go to Jesus, if the Mormons go to Jesus and say, "Oh, we faithfully stored up $100 billion, now you can use it for your second coming." First off, Jesus wouldn't need their money, but if he did need their money, what good would it be? If you had gold or silver or precious stone, something tangible, okay. But all they've got is pieces of paper, which would be Federal Reserve notes. This is good for the settlement of all debts, public and private. Well, that's what the Federal Reserve says, with the backing of the U.S. Treasury. But if Jesus comes and annihilates the world, well, then there is no U.S. Treasury, there is no Federal Reserve, and so $100 billion of pieces of paper would be completely worthless. So it just makes no sense.
Well, I was going to say, they basically just called Jesus a liar, because God's Word says, well, number one, the love of money is the root of all evil. So you're basically saying Jesus loves money so much that he wants all this money. But number two, what's the verse that says you can't serve two gods?
Yeah, you either serve God or mammon. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a ridiculous thing to say, "Oh, well, we're going to use the money for Jesus' second coming." Jesus doesn't need it. Jesus teaches against it. You look at Jesus on the earth with his 12 disciples. One of the disciples was a traitor, Judas Iscariot. He's the one that betrayed him. Jesus knew that Judas was the mole, so to speak, the guy who wasn't a believer. And Jesus, knowing that, handed the money over to Judas. I mean, Jesus entrusted money to a traitor, a thief.
Well,
so why would he give it to the Mormon church to stockpile for him? It doesn't make any sense. He didn't need it then. He won't need it at his second coming.
Well, and then he told Peter, go catch a fish so you could pay tribute. He said, open the fish's mouth, and there was a coin. Just goes to show you, Jesus does not need money.
Exactly, yeah. Some other highlights from this. Page 11 of the Whistleblower's complaint says that before 2015, EPA offered mutual fund-like services to BYU, the Brigham Young University that they own, and other church affiliates. Well, because BYU receives federal funding, it has to be audited. So, EPA, nonprofit, they don't have to have all these statements, but financial statements to provide. But the reason we know about the $100 billion is because of an insider got those statements from within. They're not supposed to leave the Inside Peak Advisors organization. But this whistleblower got fed up with what was going on, blew the whistle on him, got those documents, and that's how we found out about it. Well, but BYU receives federal funding, which means it has to be audited. So then the auditors needed to know the market value of EPA's funds because they were getting funds from them, or the BYU pension plan was in there in EPA. So what COP did, the Mormon Church, is they got Mark Stevens, a Mormon and audit director at Deloitte, to vouch for the audit without any auditors seeing the market value of EPA for several years. So in other words, they've got an insider at the big auditing, one of the big five audit accounting firms, Deloitte and Touche, this Mark Stevens. So they just got Mark Stevens to not do his due diligence, what his job required him, because Mark was being a good Mormon. So they got away from that. But then, of course, Deloitte, they're one of the big five. So now they start complaining about Mark and what he's doing. And so what the EPA did then was they put all of BYU's interest and everything into separate accounts. They took all the money that was in EPA for BYU and these other church affiliates, and they took them out of EPA and put them somewhere else. That way the world couldn't find out how much assets the Mormon Church really had in EPA. What happened to Mark Stevens? He wasn't with Deloitte. Deloitte and Touche got on him about it. Well, no big deal. Mark was called away as mission president to the England-London mission. How about that, huh? He loses his job. No big deal. We just put him in the Mormon Church, and we'll put him outside of the U.S. so people don't notice. Let's see. In a Deseret News article, Deseret News is published by the Mormon Church in June 2016. Dallin H. Oaks, remember he is the vice president of the Mormon Church, one of the 3 trustees of EPA, he says that the Mormon Church contributed on average $40 million per year for 30 years for all humanitarian aid efforts. I mentioned that. 40 million per year times 30 years equals $1.2 billion. Well, they've got $101 billion in the EPA. Federal law requires you distribute 5% of that $100 billion every single year. So they fell way short in making contributions to charitable or use of using the money in the nonprofit for general public good, general public purposes, which is what a 501c3 is supposed to do. So even one of the trustees even admitted, even though he probably didn't know what he was doing, that they weren't giving nearly enough according to IRS laws. In May 2018, the highest-ranking bishop of the Mormon Church, Gerald Cause, said that all funds earned by the church's investments should go back to supporting its mission to invite souls to come unto Christ. That's not what it's doing. They're just stockpiling this money for the second coming of Christ. That's not bringing souls to Christ. All they're doing is going to take over the money and supposedly give it to Jesus when he comes back. So they went against what their highest-ranking bishop said they should do. Here's an interesting tidbit. There was one time when the vice president of the Mormon Church, this was Boyd K. Packer, and he came to Mr. Clark. Remember, Roger Clark, he's the guy who manages the EPA. He's not on the board of trustees or anything. Well, the vice president, Boyd K. Packer, who would be on the board of trustees, came to Roger Clark and wanted to know how much money was in the EPA. I mean, if you're on the board of trustees, wouldn't you want to know what's there? You know, how much money do we have in this slush fund? Mr. Clark told him he couldn't share the details. Mr. Packer said, quote, "I think I should know. I'm the most senior apostle and president of the quorum of the 12 apostles, and I'm a breath away from being the next president. I think I should be prepared," end quote. Mr. Clark reaffirmed that he had been instructed, who instructed him? I don't know, not to reveal that information to Mr. Packer. And so he never found out. Here's one of the 3 trustees of the EPA entrusted to make decisions with the money, and he doesn't even know how much money is in it because this Roger Clark kept him from knowing it. And by the way, Mr. Packer died before he ever became the Mormon president, so he never knew the value. He never found out. Mr. Cause, the highest-ranking bishop of the Mormon Church, also has stated, quote, "These funds are invested solely to support the church's mission to preach the gospel to all nations and prepare for the Lord's second coming," end quote. But the truth is that no money has ever flowed out of EPA for missionary work or to prepare for the second coming. So they tell a bunch of lies to the Mormon people to say, oh, well, we use this for mission work. We're spreading the gospel with our money. And yet all they're doing is stockpiling it. They're not distributing it at all, or not even for any Mormon stated objectives. All they're doing is stockpiling money to the point that they've got $100 billion. Let's see. So I mentioned the annual tithing that they receive from Mormon faithful is $7 billion a year, and they have expenses of about $5 to $6 billion a year, and so they're stockpiling an extra $1 billion a year. Well, now the EPA fund is up to $100 billion. It's grown to such a great extent that the annual investment earnings of the EPA exceeds the annual tithing of $7 billion for Mormon members. So if you have expenses of $5 to $6 billion a year, and you're getting investment earnings greater than the $5 to $6 billion, which they are now, what that really means is that if the Mormon Church used the EPA funds, which is their money, to pay expenses, they could pay expenses forever without receiving a single dime in tithing from any Mormon member. Because if you've got $100 billion over here, and you're getting $7 billion a year in investment earnings, and your expenses are only $5 to $6 billion, well, you get to $7 billion, so now you have $107 billion. You pay your $5 billion in expenses, now you got $102 billion. You reinvest $102 billion, you get an extra $7 billion, now you got $109 billion. You pay your $5 billion in expenses, now you got $104 billion. You see, the money would never run out. They've stockpiled so much money that they could just use their investment earnings and not get a single dime from any Mormon member. So if you're a Mormon, don't be fooled by the person saying, oh, we need your tithing and it's got to be on gross income, not on net income. The Mormon church has so much money, they don't need a single dime from you, and they can still keep functioning forever based upon the money they have. Let's see, what else do we have? Custodians and brokers. Now, they have, the $100 billion. Well, they invest about 60% in stocks and 40% in cash, which most fund investors would not have so much money in cash, especially when you got all that money. You don't need it right away. You would invest more long term and have more in stock, less in cash. But anyway, so they spend 60% of it, they put into stocks. Well, any custodian or broker that's going to invest that money for you would ask for full financial statements as part of the 2001 Patriot Act to keep from funding terrorist activities. So there's a law that happened after 9/11 took place where these brokers are required to find out where the money is coming from and what you have so that they don't fund terrorist organizations. That is a federal United States law. But the EPA will not give full financial statements. Instead, they give a statement of financial condition. Their February 2018 statement said, quote, Ensign Peak does not distribute financial statements. Assets, however, are well in excess of $5 billion, and Ensign Peak is essentially without debt, end quote. At the time, their assets was $88.5 billion. That's a lot more than $5 billion. So they intentionally say that they've got a lot less money than what they really have. The fact of the matter is only 4 employees are permitted to see the EPA's actual financial statements. The president and managing director, Roger Clark, which we've mentioned, the chief investment officer, Robert Nidegger, chief financial officer, Donald Klaus, and senior accountant, Kerry Woolsey. So the 3 board trustees and the Mormon president and those high-ranking people don't have any idea how much money is in the EPA. They can't even see the financial statements. And so the whistleblower says in the statement to the IRS, quote, the COP set up EPA in 1997 for the explicit and probably illicit purpose of dumping its surplus where it could silently grow and never be noticed. It's interesting that that Mormon, and it's good to note that because Mormons, pastors or whatever they're called, preach from the pulpit to say, you need to give your tithing. Give to God of your first fruits. Give your tithing first and forego other expenses. They'll even say that you need to pay tithing before you pay water, electricity, or feed your family. And the whistleblower asked the question, would they pay tithing instead of water, electricity, or feeding your family if you knew that it would sit around by the billions until the second coming of Christ? And that's a good question. Joseph Smith, that Mormonism founder, he said that really what the EPA is doing is in line with Joseph Smith's teachings, because he says there is no sin if there is no accuser. He says in the history of the church, and this was something that he said in November 7th, 1841, this is volume 4 of the History of the Church, page 445, Joseph Smith said, quote, if you will not accuse me, I will not accuse you. If you will throw a cloak of charity over my sins, I will over yours, for charity covereth a multitude of sins. So I guess you don't really need Jesus' death on a cross. All you have to do is make sure you scratch each other's backs and you'll be okay. And so that's what really Mormon EPA people expect the regular Mormon people to do. Just cover over the fact that they're stockpiling $100 billion illegally, not paying taxes on it since they're not giving it for the public's good. If you are an EPA employee, you are required to be a full tithe payer and a temple recommend holder. And so, in fact, prior to 2017, Mr. Clark would go desk to desk requiring employees to show the temple recommend that they were required to keep current. Now, temple recommend checks are conducted electronically, automatically, and periodically. In addition, the COP implemented in 2019 a means for local clergy to electronically survey and report to church headquarters the weekly church attendance and temple worthiness of church employees who attend that specific congregation. The purpose of this Big Brother automated system was to discriminate against backsliding employees whose belief system may have migrated from orthodoxy. So if you are a Mormon, they are watching you. They know how much you give. They know if you're not giving everything you should. And they keep electronically reporting all this stuff up to headquarters to find out if you're not giving what you should. Well, maybe you're backsliding and we need to get on to you about that. And make sure you're giving all your tithe, not just net, but 10% of gross. And that's important because here's a quote from COP's own Ensign magazine. Quote, if paying tithing means that you can't pay for water or electricity, pay tithing. If paying tithing means that you can't pay your rent, pay tithing. Even if paying tithing means that you don't have enough money to feed your family, pay tithing. End quote. That is such a hypocritical statement to think they've got $100 billion stockpiled away. They could use earnings from that money to pay all their expenses and all their churches, and they don't need a dime of tithing. And here they are telling all those poor Mormon members that are at the bottom of their pyramid scheme that you got to pay money to us before you even feed your family, before you even pay your rent, and before you pay water or electricity. They are stockpiling all that money. And if you're not a tithing faithful, you are not temple recommended, which means you can't witness the temple marriages of other members. So here you are, struggling to make ends meet, and you don't have the money to pay tithing. You decide, I'm going to pay my rent before I pay tithing. Well, guess what? Your children get married in a Mormon temple, you can't even watch it. You can't even be there because you're not temple recommended, because you haven't paid your full tithing. Only the most tithing faithful males get pulled up the ranks of local and general church leadership or priesthood. Members may try to outcompete each other's righteousness by refraining from caffeinated soda, but stakes and wards divide and consolidate as a function of tithing faithful per square mile. Stakes and wards is just, a ward is a church, and a stake is a group of wards. That's their lingo, Mormon lingo. So they have all these rules. Oh, you can't refrain from caffeinated soda. Don't drink tea or coffee. But really, if you want to move up in the Mormon church, you better be paying your tithes on gross income, and that's the only way you're going to move up. And that's the only way you're even going to see your own children get married. And here it is. They've got $100 billion stockpiled away. They don't even need your money, and they're still doing this to the people. The reason that they're doing this, according to the whistleblower, is the COP is worried about losing control over their members' behavior. So EPA's job is to help the COP look smaller and keep out prying eyes so members won't lose confidence should they find out that the senior apostles can't figure out how to use $100+ billion to accomplish Christ's mission. That's what the whistleblower says it's all about. This guy worked in the EPA. He saw their financial statements. He knows what was going on there. And he just, as a faithful Mormon, he finally says, this is ridiculous. I'm getting out of this. He couldn't, in a good conscience, keep working for such an organization, even though he was a faithful Mormon all his life. The stake presidents and bishops around the world consistently teach members that beyond tithing, so you already give your tithing, well, beyond that, members should give their charity money and personal estates to the church, because at least they can be assured that the money is going to a good cause. They often say that other charities have high overhead, and you can't be sure that much of it is actually going to a good place. And giving it to the church, they can have high confidence that it is being put to work. Well, that's how their tithing already has excess over expenses of $1 to $2 billion a year. Well, then you add in charity money, personal estates, and it's even more than that $1 or $2 billion a year. And they have the audacity to teach and say, well, you better give it to us rather than to some other charity, because then you at least know it's going for a good cause. Well, the good cause is just to go into this fat bank account that they have, and they're not doing anything with it. They're just sitting on it. From 2009 to 2019, the EPA's assets grew from 10 billion or 11 billion to 101 billion dollars. They grew by $90 billion in the last 10 years, and that's where that compounding comes into play. Straightforward projections would be that continuing to do what they've been doing, that in the next 10 years, EPA's assets would grow to $336 billion. That's why I say compound interest. When you get a large amount of money like that, and you keep growing interest on that every year and you're not doing anything with it, it can just grow exponentially. And so that's what's about to happen. It's already grown $90 billion over the last 10 years, and it's about to grow over another $200 billion over the next 10 years, if it just keeps going the way it is. I mentioned the 10% tithing that they are to give. Their members are supposed to pay on gross income so that they merit gross blessings as opposed to net blessings. It is common knowledge that gross payers who are male are more likely to advance in the ranks of priesthood offices. So, you got $100 billion. How many employees are of the EPA? They only have 20 employees in 2010, 75 employees in 2019. This $100 billion plus corporation doesn't even have a sign on the building or in the lobby downstairs to identify what the offices are. They're trying to keep this all hush-hush and a secret. And they have so few employees. And they even went to the extent of, in 2014, the EPA was using Bloomberg servers. Now, Bloomberg is a big financial corporation, and they were using their servers to track all their portfolio assets and everything. And they got so paranoid, they were afraid that Bloomberg employees might reverse engineer data to figure out what their true assets are. And so the EPA stopped using Bloomberg servers and created their own solution. They are so paranoid that people are going to figure out how much money they really have, that they hide it at all costs. The whistleblower identified 452 offshore accounts that have received over $11.1 billion from 11 COP accounts over a 10-year period. So in addition to EPA and what they've got going, well, there are all these offshore accounts. They're hiding money. In addition to the $100 billion they're hiding in EPA, they're hiding money in 452 offshore accounts. The whistleblower also found multiple occasions of deleting receivables, thus creating dark money. If you don't know accounting, basically in layman's terms, what they were doing is receivables is we're about to get money, but instead of, they didn't actually record that. They just deleted it. It was on their books as a receivable, well then they delete it. So then when the money comes in, there's not a record that you should have the money. and that's why it's called dark money. So again, they're hiding money there. In May 2018, this KUTV station reported that 13 holding companies potentially owned by the Mormon Church collectively own $32.7 billion in U.S. stocks at year-end 2017. The next day, an emergency staff meeting was led by the chief investment officer to discuss how new holding companies could be created to obfuscate their equity positions. In other words, they're afraid, oh no, this TV station found out we have $32.7 billion. We really have a lot more money than that. So now let's create some other holding companies, and we'll do it. They decided that they would do it over time, over many years, which would be more effective for full reconcealment. So when people find out that they got the money, they figure out a different way to hide it, to create these new holding companies so you won't know about it anymore. You just change the names, move the money around, change the names so people won't know about it. And yet you have members of the Mormon Church having to raise funds. It is required of all males to go on missions, and it's optional for females. Well, the COP recently announced that the monthly dues for missionary service will increase by 25% in 2020, from $400 per member per month to $500 per member per month. Not only do you have to pay your 10% tithing, your charity money, your estate giving, and all do that on gross, and you need to do that above paying your rent and your water and electricity, but you're also required to have send your kids on missions, and you're required to pay $500 per month to support them on the missions. What, your $100 billion slush fund isn't enough to pay for the mission? I mean, they're doing Mormon work. You'd think they do it for free. I know the Salvation Army, at least years ago, they would do that. You want to go to their to their seminary to become a pastor, you wouldn't have to pay anything for that. You'd go there, and then, of course, you would agree to become a pastor afterward. But here, Mormon missionaries, you got to pay $500 a month to send your kids to mission, which is required in their organization. Church assets are estimated to be over $200 billion. But very few members know anything about the EPA at all. The whistleblower estimates that if the IRS determined that the EPA was not making their qualifying supporting distributions per year, which they are not, then their nominal excise penalties would be $26.1 billion with interest. So they owe the IRS a lot of money if the IRS does it. But if the Mormons have people in the IRS, they'll look the other way. In Wikipedia's list of wealthiest organizations, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is listed as the wealthiest among all charitable, educational, and religious institutions with a net worth of $67 billion. But they didn't know about the EPA investments. They're really over $200 billion. They're a lot larger than what people knew about. Let's see. And here's an interesting tidbit. Another reason why they've got the EPA slush fund is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the corporation, the church, shall only be liable for its own debts and obligations, and shall not be obligated for any debt, liability, obligation, contract, or commitment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or any of its affiliates, subsidiaries, agents, officers, employees, members, or representatives. In other words, that's just fancy lingo for saying that, let's say there was a big sex scandal in the Mormon Church like there was with the Catholic Church, and you had all these victims suing for all this money. What it means is they can't get any of the EPA's money. It's in that slush fund, $100 billion set aside the EPA. Oh, that's completely separate from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It doesn't matter that the top 3 ranking officers in the Mormon Church are the same members of the Board of Trustees of the EPA. It's separate. So if anyone sued and there's this big verdict, let's say $50 billion verdict against the Mormon Church, in some court, they couldn't take any money from the EPA. That's why they do it. They're stockpiling all this money, and it can't be touched, legally speaking. The corporation, the COP, doesn't have any members. It can only be dissolved by the current first presidency of the Mormon Church. Remember, it's a sole proprietorship. So they don't owe any obligations to any of its membership. You can be a member of the Mormon Church, but you don't have anything to do with the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because that's owned by the president. It's a sole proprietorship. So if the president of the Mormon Church decided to dissolve the corporation, the trustees would then distribute the money to the church and its affiliates in such proportions and at such times as the trustees may select. So it's those top three guys. They're the ones who would distribute it. Because the first presidency and the trustees are the same people. This structure is unique among 501c3s. No one else has such a structure like that. It's being an accountant, I know that auditors require internal controls, checks and balances. There are no checks and balances here. Okay, the Mormon Church has something like let's see, I had this somewhere. I think it's 15 million members worldwide. At least that's what they say. I think it was 15 million. Anyway, if you divide the assets of the EPA into each member, it comes out to approximately $25,000 per member is what they've got in that EPA. And they're $25,000 per member, and you're begging each Mormon, oh, don't pay your rent, don't pay your electricity, don't pay food for your family, give the tithes to the Mormon Church. It'll go to a good cause. Yeah, it goes into their pockets. They could dissolve the EPA and give $25,000 each to each member, especially in these other countries. You think how much, they'd be rich. $25,000, but of course they're not going to do that. They're all greedy. All right, that's all the information I wanted to share with you. $100 billion just sitting there. In 10 years, it'll grow to over $300 billion. Thanks for watching.